In some places, time is not measured in hours, but in buried secrets and voices no one dares to hear. In Blackwood Valley, people woke one morning beneath a heavy fog, unaware that this single morning would take 10 years to end. This is not a story of a simple disappearance. It is the story of a father who handed his son to hope and watched hope hand him to monsters. A mother who sat before an empty grave at dawn, knowing the truth was not buried there. And a brother who learned in war that no one is ever left behind. Some mornings arrive late, but when they come, they change everything. Welcome to Unclosed, where stories begin but never truly end. Tonight, I'll tell you a story you've never heard before. Everyone in Blackwood Valley remembers the 10th morning as if memory itself had been folded and ironed into a single, unyielding crease. The fog that day lay over the ridges like a heavy, damp cloth. It filled the hollows and pooled in the low fields, and the valley seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a verdict from the world itself. What people recalled most was not the color of the sky, but the way a father's hope had been folded into a sealed wooden box and lowered into the earth. They remembered, too, that some truths do not die with a burial. They sleep, patient as seeds, waiting for a season that may arrive a decade later. The valley learned, in the slow arithmetic of grief, that a morning could take 10 years to finally arrive. Blackwood Valley was a place of hard soil and harder people. The ranches were stitched into the land like old scars. The pines kept their own counsel, whispering secrets in the wind that carried gossip as readily as it carried seed. In 2007, Samuel lived there on a failing sheep ranch that had once been his father's pride. His face was a map of winters, his hands thick with the calluses of a life that had never known ease. He spoke little, but his silence was not emptiness. It was the kind of measured quiet that had learned to weigh words against the cost of living. Samuel's two sons were the axis of his days. Jacob, the elder, had returned from 2 tours with the 101st Airborne, carrying the discipline and the quiet rage of a man who had seen the worst of the world. He distrusted institutions the way some men distrusted storms, because he had watched them break things they were meant to protect. He stayed on the ranch for one reason alone: to keep his brother safe. Eli was the center of Samuel's life in a way that made the rest of the world seem incidental. At 20, he had the body of a man, but the mind of a child. He loved simple things with a devotion that made them holy: a blue butterfly resting on a fence post, a wooden bird perched on a windowsill, the way sunlight pooled like liquid gold on the porch steps. He did not know the family name. He could not find his way back from the creek if he wandered too far. He was tethered to his mother, Martha, who watched him with a vigilance that had the shape of prayer. Martha's protection was not merely habit. It was a constant, fierce labor against a world that had little patience for the slow and the gentle. Samuel's fear was not the ordinary fear of a man who might lose his land. It was a private, gnawing terror. What would become of Eli when Samuel was gone? What would happen when Martha's hands could no longer hold him? The question sat in Samuel's chest like a stone. It was a crack in his armor, and men like Mr. Sterling were skilled at finding such cracks. Mr. Sterling lived 300 miles to the south behind high walls and manicured hedges. He had built his fortune on timber and political favors, on buying influence the way other men bought cattle. He wore suits that seemed cut from the same fabric as his promises: smooth, expensive, and impossible to stain. He spoke with a voice that made lies sound like scripture. He had learned, over decades, how to make people believe that his wealth was a kind of mercy. He had learned, too, how to make the machinery of a county bend to a whisper and a check. Sterling's son, Matthew, was not merely a spoiled heir. His temper had been fed by indulgence, and his conscience had been softened by the knowledge that consequences could be bought. He drank to silence the small, persistent voice telling him he was less than his father's shadow. He fought to feel anything at all in the quiet rooms of the estate. Sterling watched his son with pity and calculation. He had built an empire that required a spotless name. He had taught Matthew that the family name was the ledger that balanced everything else. When Matthew's violence spilled into murder, Sterling's first thought was containment, not remorse. He had the means. He thought in transactions, a life for a ledger entry, a silence for a donation. That night, after a dinner of too much wine and too little restraint, Matthew's temper snapped like a brittle twig. A thrown glass, a pushed shoulder, a fist that landed with the suddenness of a storm. What began as a quarrel ended with a man on the floor and a yard that swallowed his last breath. Matthew stood over him, chest heaving, the room spinning with the taste of iron and the knowledge that nothing could be undone. He looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. In the quiet that followed, he called his father. Sterling arrived with the calm of a man who had always believed money could smooth any jagged edge. They spoke in low voices. The ledger was opened in Sterling's mind. The decision was made not in malice, but in arithmetic. A name preserved, a scandal buried. The plan that followed was clinical and cold. Sterling's offer arrived like a polished coin on a rough table. He sat on Samuel's porch one autumn afternoon, the iced tea sweating in his hand, and watched Eli trace the grain of his wooden bird. "Samuel," he said, leaning forward, "you look tired. The ranch is failing. Winters take more than they give. Let the boy come with me. He'll learn work. He'll be among people who can give him a future. You can visit. You can collect his pay." It's time he stepped out from his mother's shadow. To Samuel, the words were a lantern in a long tunnel. He pictured steady wages, shoes that fit, a roof that did not leak. He wanted to believe. Martha heard the word work and felt the house itself tremble. "Never," she cried, the sound raw and immediate. "Eli is not a worker. He's our son. You would send him to the wolves." Jacob stood with his mother and offered to sell his truck, to work double shifts, to do anything to keep Eli at home. He smelled Sterling's money and found it rotten. "Something about that man smells like rot," he said, the kind of voice that had learned to trust only its own hands. Samuel's worry hardened into a decision. He told himself he was being responsible, that he was choosing a future over a slow, certain ruin. He believed Sterling's words because he wanted to believe them. He believed, and in believing he made a choice that would break the family. The day the men came, the fog was thick enough to swallow the barn. Eli screamed because he did not understand the language of promises. He clutched the porch rail until his knuckles whitened. He called for his mother in a voice that would haunt her for years. The black truck's taillights vanished into the mist, and with them went the small, ordinary certainties of a family. The men who took him spoke of opportunity and supervision. Their politeness made their hands colder. Samuel watched them drive away and felt the rope of hope tighten and then fray. 10 mornings later, a police cruiser's lights cut through the mist at Samuel's gate. The sheriff, a man Samuel had known for 2 decades, led him to the county morgue. They did not show him a body. They placed a small, tattered cardboard box on a metal table. Inside were the things Eli loved: a denim jacket stained with earth, a chipped wooden bird. The sheriff's voice was a hollow thing. "We're sorry, Sam." He ran away. He jumped into the canal near the chemical mill. The current was strong, the chemicals that changed him. We couldn't identify the face. The clothes match. The story was a carefully constructed lie. Sterling had chosen a victim with the precision of a predator. Mateo, a young seasonal worker who had crossed the border in search of work, had no papers, no family to ask questions, no voice that would be heard. Eli had been a witness. Sterling could not risk his son's ruin, so he engineered a social death for Eli. He dressed Mateo in Eli's clothes, dumped the body in a toxic canal, and used his influence to make the death official. The coroner who signed the certificate had gambling debts quietly paid by Sterling's estate. The sheriff who delivered the news owed his career to Sterling's donations. The paperwork became a fortress. Sterling was already at the morgue when Samuel arrived. His face was a mask of practiced grief. He threw his arms around Samuel, sobbing loudly about how he had tried to stop the boy, how Eli had been distraught and homesick from the first hour. He claimed witnesses, honest men who had seen the boy leap into the toxic waters. Samuel, exhausted and raw, wanted to believe. He wanted the story to be true because the alternative, knowing his son had been taken and used, was a cruelty too large to hold. When Samuel returned to the ranch with the small box, Martha's grief turned to a sound that was not human. She screamed at the sky, at Samuel, at the mountains. "You sent him to his grave for a handful of silver," she cried, and the guilt ate Samuel alive. He stopped rising with the sun. He sat on the porch at night and watched the fireflies until the light in his chest dimmed. The neighbors found him one morning slumped in his chair, hands folded over the wooden bird, as if in benediction. He did not wake. The valley buried him and left Martha alone with a ritual that became a legend. For 10 years, Martha sat by a headstone every morning before dawn. She brought a thermos of tea and spoke to the grass, as if the boy were buried beneath it. The townspeople called her the Mourning Mother and pitted her for what they thought was madness. They did not know that the grave was a lie. They did not know that the boy she mourned was alive 300 miles away, living a life of cruelty in the shadow of the high peaks. 300 miles south, in a place of scrub and rock, a man named Frank ran a gas station that was more a lifeline than a business. He knew the faces of the county and the stories people tried to bury. Years earlier, his cousin had vanished while working for a powerful man. The case had been quietly closed. Frank could not ignore another family being broken. One sweltering afternoon, a figure appeared on the road leading to the high timber line. A man leading a flock of scrawny sheep, moving with a hesitant, swaying gait. Frank watched him approach the pumps and felt a chill despite the heat. The man was in his late 20s, skin darkened by the sun, clothes patched from burlap and wool. His eyes were wide and vacant, the look of someone who lived in a world of immediate wonders. He stared at a soda machine as if it were a miracle. "Frank, offer bottle." The man drank like a man who had been given water after a long drought. Eli blinked, unsure if the man before him was real. He took a hesitant step forward, then froze, staring at the bottle Frank held. The heat, the dust, the unfamiliar voice, all pressed down on him like a tide. "What's your name?" Frank asked. The man looked down at his feet and whispered, "Eli?" "My name is Eli." Frank's memory reached back to the headlines about the drowned boy of Blackwood Valley. He thought of the closed casket and the sealed box. He watched Eli and saw the same small gestures, the way he cradled a wooden bird in his hands, the way his face softened at the sound of a lullaby. Frank began to visit the high trails, bringing sandwiches and clean water. He learned that Eli's mind was as the stories had said, a child's soul in a man's body. Eli did not know he had been stolen. He knew only the master and the sheep. Frank noticed details others might have missed. Eli's hands bore the faint, familiar calluses of a man who had once held a porch rail. The way he tilted his head at the sound of a distant train matched a memory Frank had seen in an old photograph of the ranch. Frank took a Polaroid of Eli one afternoon, the instant print developing in his hand like a small, stubborn truth. He tucked the photo into his wallet and, over the next weeks, began to collect other small things. A scrap of denim with a distinctive stitch, a boot print in the mud that matched the tread of a truck Frank had seen in the valley years before, a torn corner of a paper receipt with a partial name. Each fragment was a quiet accusation. When Frank asked Eli if he had a father, the name that came back was a whisper, Samuel. The word landed in Frank like a stone. He could not go to the local sheriff. The master's influence reached into those offices. So Frank closed his shop, put a back in a week sign on the door, and drove north. Jacob was running the ranch with a soldier's efficiency when Frank arrived. The years had carved Jacob into a man who moved with purpose. The ranch had become his mission and his penance. Frank showed him the Polaroid and told him what he had seen. Jacob's face did not register surprise so much as a long, slow ignition. He had buried his brother, and his father had died under the weight of that lie. He had trusted the law once and found it hollow. He did not call the sheriff. He called the men who had been his brothers in arms. Their code was simple: no man left behind. They moved with a precision that had been honed in war. Under a moonless sky, they followed Frank back to the high peaks. Jacob had learned to plan for contingencies. He had learned to expect the worst and to prepare for it. They scouted the perimeter, noted the patrol patterns, and found the weak points in the master's defenses. They did not go in as a mob. They went in as a unit. Jacob signaled to his men. Jacob felt his heart hammering in his chest, each step a prayer that they would find Eli before it was too late. Each moved like a shadow, silent and precise. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and fear. "No mistakes," Jacob whispered again, and they advanced. When they breached the iron gates, they did not find a farm, but a labor camp. Eli was chained in a dark barn, sleeping on wet hay beside the animals, eating from trough. He did not recognize Jacob at first. He whimpered and crawled into a corner. Jacob began to sing a lullaby their father had hummed when storms rolled over the valley. The sound reached something in Eli that had been buried under years of fear. He lowered his hands and whispered, "Brother." The master who had kept Eli was a hired mercenary, a man whose life had been shaped by contracts and the absence of mercy. He reached for a shotgun and found himself outmatched by men who had learned to move as one. Jacob did not kill him. He wanted him alive to talk. The men took the master into custody and found, in his cabin, a hidden safe. It did not contain only money. It contained records of ledgers of wire transfers, names, dates, receipts that traced a line back to Sterling's estate. The master, faced with the certainty of a life behind bars, began to talk. They did not find only money. The ledger showed favors, hush payments, and connections tracing back to Sterling. The details were complex, but the pattern was clear. Crimes had been hidden behind wealth and influence. The truth spilled out in pieces. 10 years earlier, Matthew Sterling had murdered Mateo in a drunken rage. Eli had seen it. Sterling had chosen not to kill Eli outright. He had chosen a more insidious fate. He had used his wealth to make a death official, to buy silence, to bury a man's name and replace it with another. He had shipped Eli to the high peaks and kept him there as a living secret. The coroner and the sheriff had been paid or threatened into complicity. The paperwork that declared Eli dead was a lie written in ink and fear. But the path to justice was not a single, clean line. Jacob and his men could not simply drive to the courthouse and hand over a photograph. Sterling's reach was long. He had friends in county offices, in the coroner's office, in the sheriff's department. The first attempts to bring charges were met with delays, lost files, and polite refusals. Jacob learned that the law could be bought and that the machinery of justice could be slowed to a crawl. He also learned that the federal system, when approached correctly, could not be as easily bent. Frank had contacts, an old friend who worked for a federal investigator who had a reputation for following money. They sent a coded alert to an independent jurisdiction, and, slowly, the dam of silence began to crack. The investigation revealed a network of lies and bribes, linking Sterling to the boy's disappearance. Officials had been quietly paid, checks exchanged for silence, but the pattern of wrongdoing could no longer be hidden. Each witness added a piece of truth, and slowly, justice began to take shape. The interrogation of the master was long and ugly. He named names, dates, amounts. He produced receipts he had kept as insurance. Sterling's son had been reckless and violent. Sterling had been careful and cold. The man who had once been a local benefactor had built his empire on favors and threats. He had cultivated the sheriff with donations, the coroner with quiet payments, and the town with the illusion of prosperity. He had convinced people that his wealth was their prosperity. He had convinced himself that his family's name was worth more than a life. The trial was not a single day of revelation, but a long, public process that peeled back layers. Witnesses who had once been quiet found their voices under subpoena. The master, who had once been a man of few words, spoke at length when faced with the certainty of a life behind bars. He described nights of payment and instruction, of trucks that came and went, of a boy who had been moved like a piece on a board. The coroner's testimony was the most damning. A man who had once signed a certificate without looking at a face now had to explain why he had done so. Under oath, the small transactions that had once seemed innocuous became the threads that tied a powerful man to a crime. When the convoy returned to Blackwood Valley with Eli, the town gathered in a silence that felt like a held breath. Martha sat by the grave as she always had, thermos at her side. She saw the black trucks and the police cars, and then she saw him, a tall, bearded man with the eyes of the child who had once clutched the porch railings. She did not scream. She did not faint. She walked toward him with the slow, steady grace of a woman who had never stopped waiting. She touched his face and said, simply, "I told them you weren't under that dirt. I told them you were waiting for the sun." Eli's return was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long, uneven healing. He had lived 10 years in captivity, his mind shaped by routines that had no kindness. He did not know how to sit at a table without waiting for permission. He did not know how to sleep in a bed without fear. Martha taught him again, slowly, with patience that had been sharpened by grief. She showed him that the porch was safe, that the kettle's whistle was not a command but a comfort, that the sound of rain on the roof was not a signal to hide. Jacob rebuilt the ranch with the same discipline he had carried from war. He repaired fences, sold livestock, and planted new seed. He did not speak often of what had happened, but his silence was not emptiness. It was a shield. He had learned that some wounds do not close with words. He watched his brother with a soldier's vigilance, ready to step in when the world threatened to overwhelm him. The town changed too. The trial had exposed not only Sterling's crimes, but the complicity of men who had once been trusted. The sheriff resigned in disgrace. The coroner left the county under a cloud of shame. People who had once accepted donations with gratitude now looked at money with suspicion. The valley learned that prosperity built on silence was a fragile thing. They began to rebuild trust in smaller, slower ways. Neighbors helping neighbors, committees formed not to please donors but to protect children. Mateo, the man whose body had been used to bury a lie, was finally given his name back. His remains were exhumed from the canal and laid to rest in a cemetery where migrant workers gathered to honor him. His family, reached through distant cousins, came to stand by the grave. They spoke in Spanish, words of sorrow and dignity, and the valley listened. For the first time, the town understood that the lie had stolen not only Eli's life, but Mateo's too. Justice was not complete until both names were restored. Sterling and his son were sentenced. The father received decades for conspiracy and obstruction. The son received years for manslaughter and abuse. The estate that had once been a symbol of power was sold piece by piece. The manicured hedges grew wild, the gates rusted, and the house became a ruin that children whispered about. The name Sterling, once spoken with reverence, became a cautionary tale. Martha's ritual changed. She no longer sat by the empty grave at dawn. Instead, she sat on the porch with Eli, watching the fog lift from the valley. She told him stories of his childhood, of the mornings he had chased butterflies, of the nights he had fallen asleep with a wooden bird in his hand. Eli listened with the quiet of a man who had been given back his life. He did not understand all the words, but he understood the love. The valley marked the 10th morning not with ceremony, but with silence. People woke to find the fog thinner, the air clearer. They said the valley had finally exhaled. They said the morning that had taken 10 years to arrive had finally come. Eli stood on the porch and looked at the horizon. He was no longer the boy who had been taken, nor the captive who had been hidden. He was a man who had survived absence and returned to presence. He had learned that absence is not death, that some mornings arrive slowly, step by step, after years of waiting, and he was ready for each one. And so the story closed as it had begun, with a truth that refused to be buried. This is Unclosed, where stories begin but never truly end. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until we meet again, good night.